The Black Anvil Saloon sat at the edge of Harney County like a bad tooth nobody had gotten around to pulling. It occupied the far end of a cracked asphalt lot on the outskirts of a town that didn't appear on most maps, and the ones that did include it spelled the name wrong. The building itself was old, older than the county road that ran past it, built from timber and rough-cut stone back when men still settled arguments with axes instead of lawyers. The roof sagged slightly on the eastern side where a pine had come down in the ice storm of 2009, and nobody had ever bothered to fix it quite right. A hand-painted sign above the door read Black Anvil in faded black letters, the paint peeling at the edges, curling back like dried skin. Beneath it, a neon horseshoe hung in the window, glowing amber in the dark, buzzing with the uneven hum of old glass tubing that had never quite been replaced. It was a Tuesday night in late October, and the air outside carried the first serious bite of the season. The kind of cold that didn't announce itself, that simply arrived and settled into the joints and the low places, and reminded men of a certain age that their bodies were keeping a running tally of every hard year they had ever lived. Inside, the bar smelled the way it always smelled. Stale beer soaked deep into the wooden floorboards over decades. The sharp chemical undercurrent of cheap cleaning product that never quite won the battle. Motor oil and leather and tobacco smoke embedded so thoroughly into the walls and ceiling that the smell had become structural, as much a part of the building as the timber frame. The light was dim and amber, coming mostly from four bare bulbs strung along the back bar and the faint glow of the jukebox in the corner, which was currently working through a Merle Haggard record at a volume low enough not to intrude on conversation, but present enough to fill the silence. Garrett Mace sat in the corner booth. He had been sitting in that same booth, in that same position, on Tuesday nights for going on 11 years. It was the booth with the high wooden back that faced the door and left no angle uncovered. The booth where a man could see everything that walked in without being seen himself until he chose to be. Garrett had chosen that booth the first night he walked into the Black Anvil, and he had never sat anywhere else. He was 52 years old, built like a man who had spent his 20s doing physical work and his 30s doing things considerably worse. His shoulders were broad and slightly rounded forward, the permanent posture of a big man who had spent a lifetime ducking through doorways. His hands rested flat on the table in front of him, and they were the hands of someone who had used them hard. Every knuckle slightly enlarged, a thin white scar running diagonally across the back of the right one from a night in Boise he never discussed. His beard was thick and going gray at the jaw, still dark around the mustache, giving his face a two-tone quality in low light. His eyes were the color of old asphalt, gray with flecks of something darker, and they moved slowly and constantly around the room in the way that men develop when they have spent long enough in environments where being the last one to notice something means being the last one to do anything about it. He wore his colors, the leather vest over a black thermal shirt, the cut heavy with patches earned over 2 decades with the charter, the winged death's head on the back. President, Harney County. It wasn't a decoration. It was a declaration of what he was and what he had chosen to be, worn so long it had stopped feeling like a choice and simply become part of the architecture of who Garrett Mace was in the world. His right knee ached. It had been aching since early September when the barometric pressure started dropping ahead of the season change. The knee was a souvenir from a wreck outside of Bend in 2004, a truck that had drifted lanes on a rain-slicked highway and sent him over the guardrail and down a 40-foot embankment. He had walked away from it, which everyone agreed was a minor miracle, but the knee had never fully forgiven him for the experience. On nights like this, he felt it like a dull internal argument he could not end. He was thinking about the Sturgis run. They needed to lock down the route by the first week of November, coordinate with the Boise charter on the fuel stops, figure out the lodging situation in Rapid City. He was also thinking, in a quieter part of his mind, about the freight arrangement with the logging operation up near John Day, whether the timing still worked given that 2 of his better men were looking at county charges that could pull them off the road by spring. He had been carrying both of these problems the way he carried most things, silently and without visible strain, rotating them slowly in the background of his mind, while the front of him simply sat and drank. The bourbon in his glass was cheap. Garrett could afford better and occasionally bought it for other people, but for himself, he always ordered the house pour. It was a habit from leaner years that had calcified into preference. He picked up the glass and took a slow sip, feeling the burn settle in his chest, and set it back down on the ring-shaped stain it had already made on the table. Decker was behind the bar. He was a broad man in his mid-40s with a shaved head and a beard that grew in 3 different directions, and he had been tending bar at the Black Anvil for 8 years after a stint with the charter that had ended when a broken arm healed wrong and left him unable to grip a handlebar properly in cold weather. He didn't complain about it. He poured drinks and kept inventory, and occasionally removed people from the premises with a calm efficiency that never required him to raise his voice. He was good at his job and Garrett trusted him, which was not something Garrett said or demonstrated often, but which Decker understood through the particular language of men who had known each other long enough to communicate without speaking. Briggs was at the pool table near the back hallway. He was 38, lean and angular, with the kind of face that looked perpetually sunburned regardless of season. He held the pool cue loosely, lining up a shot with the unhurried concentration of a man with nothing particular on his mind, which was never actually true of Briggs, but which he performed convincingly. 2 other members, Calloway and a newer man they called Etch, were at a table near the window playing cards with a seriousness that suggested money was involved. It was quiet. The jukebox finished haggard and moved into something slower, a Johnny Cash number, the bass frequencies vibrating faintly in the wooden bench beneath Garrett's thighs. The rain that had been threatening since sundown was beginning to arrive, tapping unevenly against the windows, the drops large and intermittent, the advanced scouts of something heavier moving in from the coast. Garrett was looking at the amber surface of his bourbon and thinking about the John Day freight timing when the door opened. The wind came in first, a cold gust that moved through the room and lifted the edge of a napkin off the bar and pushed the flame of the candle in the old mason jar on the nearest table sideways. It carried the smell of wet gravel and pine resin and incoming rain, and it made every man in the room register the door without consciously deciding to look at it. Then the sound came in with the wind. It was breathing, ragged and wet and completely wrong for the space. The sound of lungs taking what they needed regardless of who was watching or what impression was being made. It was the breathing of someone who had been running hard and long enough that the body had begun overriding the mind's attempts at control. The girl stood in the doorway. She was 16 years old, though in that first moment most of the men in the room would not have been able to say exactly how old she was, only that she was young, very young, and that she was in considerable trouble. She was wearing a torn denim jacket over a gray t-shirt that was dark with wet in patches across the shoulders and chest. Her jeans were ripped at both knees, the denim frayed and dirty, and her left foot was bare, the skin of it pale against the dark floorboards, a muddy smear on the arch where she had been running through wet ground. Her right foot wore a dirty canvas sneaker, laces untied. The asymmetry of it was somehow the most jarring detail, more jarring even than the bruise spreading across her right cheek, more jarring than the split lower lip that was leaking a slow dark line of blood down her chin. Her chest was heaving, her hair was dark and wet and plastered to the sides of her face and neck. Her eyes moved around the room fast, the pupils blown wide and black in the dim light, taking in the pool table and the bar and the men and the low ceiling and the jukebox. The eyes of someone doing a rapid and desperate calculation about where they were and what that meant for their immediate survival. The pool cue stopped moving. Briggs had gone completely still, the stick frozen at a 45-degree angle, not finishing the shot, not setting it down, just stopped. Calloway and Etch had turned in their chairs without making a sound. Decker's hand had stopped moving the glass he had been drying for the last 90 seconds and simply held it stationary over the bar. Garrett did not move at all. He watched her from the corner booth with a stillness that was not passive but watchful, the complete arrested attention of a man who had trained himself to gather information before spending reaction. The girl's eyes moved around the room, and then they landed on Garrett. Even from across the bar in the dim amber light, even in the state she was in, there was something in the way she looked at him that was not random. It was recognition of a particular kind, the instinctive recognition that people have for authority, for whoever in a room carries the gravity of the person who makes the decisions. She found it in him in less than 3 seconds, and then she moved. She didn't walk. She crossed the room at something between a fast walk and a run, her bare foot leaving wet, dark prints on the floorboards, her sneakered foot squeaking softly once on a smooth section of wood. She wasn't looking at anyone else. She came directly to the corner booth and threw herself into the narrow space between the booth's bench and the wall, getting behind Garrett's mask the way a smaller animal gets behind the largest available solid object when something is coming for it. Briggs finally set the pool cue down. It hit the felt of the table with a soft thud. Decker set the glass down on the bar without looking at it, his eyes on the booth. Garrett still had not moved. He felt the girl arrive behind him, felt the disruption in the air, heard the soft, desperate sound of her trying to get her breathing under control. He looked down at his left side, where her hand had appeared, reaching up from below the level of the table, fingers closing around a fistful of his leather cut. The fingers were shaking. The nails were bitten down to nothing, the skin around them chapped and raw. She was gripping the leather with everything she had, the knuckles bloodless and white. "Please." Her voice was wrecked. Scraped raw somewhere prior to this room, used up shouting or screaming somewhere before she arrived here. It came out barely above a whisper. "Please." Garrett looked at the hand on his vest. He did not like people touching his cut. In 20 years of wearing it, he had made that clear to enough people that it had become common knowledge within a significant radius. He looked at the small, wrecked hand gripping it now, and he did not remove it. He looked back up at the door. "Shut it," he said. His voice was low and flat, gravel over packed earth. He was talking to the room in general, and to Briggs specifically, who was closest to the entrance. Briggs moved toward the door. He didn't reach it. The headlights came first, sweeping across the frosted glass of the windows, painting a moving bar of white light across the far wall. Then the red and blue strobed in, the frantic light of a patrol car splashing off the ceiling and the mirror behind the bar and the chrome of the beer taps. The sound of tires on gravel, aggressive, the kind of parking that announces itself. The girl made a sound behind Garrett's back that was not a word. It was a high and very thin sound that came from somewhere below language, from whatever part of a person generates noise when the thing they have been running from has arrived. She pressed herself tighter into the space behind him, her hand twisting in the leather of his cut, her forehead coming down against the back of the booth. "Don't let him take me." The words came out broken, each one slightly separate, fighting their way out through the breathing. "He'll kill me. He said he'll kill me this time." Garrett's eyes moved to the windows. The strobing light was steady, the car parked and engine running. One vehicle. He processed that without commenting on it. He looked at her hand on his vest again. He thought about what she smelled like, which was sweat and copper and cold night air, and the particular sour smell of sustained adrenaline. He thought about her pupils, which he had seen clearly when she crossed the room, blown wide and black and entirely genuine. He thought about the split lip and the bruise and the missing shoe and the bare foot with the mud on the arch. And he thought about how far a person runs through wet ground before they lose a shoe and don't stop to retrieve it. He thought about all of this in the time it took the heavy oak door of the Black Anvil Saloon to swing open for the second time that night. Deputy Harlan Greer stepped inside. He was a big man, 45 years old, carrying the weight of someone who had been athletic in his 30s and had since allowed the muscle to migrate and settle. He was not fat, exactly. He was dense. He wore his county uniform with the pressed precision of a man who considers the presentation of authority to be a form of communication. The tan shirt crisp even at this hour, the badge catching the amber light above the bar. His duty belt was heavy and organized, every piece of equipment in its designated place. He had a mustache that he kept trimmed short, and his hair was dark and neat beneath the brim of his hat. He had the walk of a man who was accustomed to being the largest presence in whatever room he entered. Not swaggering exactly, simply occupying space with the settled confidence of someone who rarely encountered a room that pushed back. He paused inside the threshold and let the door swing shut behind him. He looked around the Black Anvil the way men like him always looked at places like this, with the contempt that authority develops for spaces it cannot fully control. His eyes moved across Decker behind the bar, across Calloway and Etch at their table, across Briggs now standing away from the pool table, and then they tracked the wet footprints on the floor. The prints led directly to the corner booth, directly to Garrett. Harlan Greer let out a short breath through his nose. He crossed the room with his thumbs in his duty belt, his boots loud on the floorboards, the kind of deliberate noise that is meant to announce arrival and establish timing. He stopped approximately 5 feet from the corner booth. He looked down at the edge of the booth, at what was visible of the girl pressed into the space behind Garrett. Just a torn denim sleeve and a pale, muddy foot. He looked back up at Garrett. "Evening," Harlan said. His tone was the professional warmth of a man who understood that the management of a situation began with tone, and that tone could be withdrawn at will. "Looks like you boys found my stray." Garrett said nothing. He held his glass of bourbon and looked at the deputy with the flat and patient attention of a man who was in no hurry and had learned that silence was frequently more informative than speaking. Harlan absorbed the silence without visible discomfort. He had encountered it before in rooms like this. He shifted slightly, resettling his weight. "Girl's name is Chloe," he said, adopting the measured cadence of a man reading from a report he has memorized. "Ward of the state. She's bounced through 3 placements this year. Disturbed kid. Violent when she gets going." He paused and touched the corner of his mouth with one finger, a small, deliberate gesture. "Busted my lip open when I tried to transport her down on Route 9 about 20 minutes ago. Cut her hand on the window frame getting out of the cruiser. Whatever she told you in the last 5 minutes, understand you're hearing one side of a situation that is considerably more complicated than a scared teenager in a bar." He said it well. He had said versions of it before. "She doesn't look violent," Garrett said. His voice was unhurried and completely level. "She looks like she went 10 rounds with something that hit back harder than she did." Harlan's expression shifted. Not dramatically, just a tightening at the corners of the eyes, a small recalibration. "She fell down an embankment getting away from the cruiser. These kids, when they're running, they don't pay attention to where they're going. She's agitated, she's confused, and she needs to be returned to county custody where she can be evaluated and placed safely." He reached one hand toward the booth, palm out, a practiced gesture of reasonable authority. "Come on out, Chloe. You're making this harder than it needs to be." From behind Garrett's back, nothing moved. There was only the barely audible sound of the girl pressing herself further into the space between the bench and the wall, making herself smaller by increments. The sound of someone trying to stop existing in a particular location through sheer force of will. Garrett picked up his bourbon. He took a slow sip. He set the glass down. He looked at Harlan Greer over the rim as he did it, and something in the deliberateness of the action communicated clearly that he was not a man who was going to be moved by the management of tone. "She ain't moving," Garrett said. The warmth drained out of Harlan's expression. Not all at once, in stages. The professional cordiality first, then the measured patience beneath it, and then what was left was something harder and more honest. "Garrett." He said the name the way men say names when they are transitioning from a request to a statement. "I've had a long shift. I'm not here to create a problem for your club. I'm here for the girl, and I'm leaving with her. You interfere with an officer in the lawful performance of his duties. I will make that stick. You know I will." "You got a warrant?" Garrett asked. Harlan blinked. "She's a ward of the state, a runaway minor. I don't need a warrant to—" "Seems like a question worth asking," Garrett said. He reached into the breast pocket of his vest and produced a silver Zippo. He set it on the table in front of him, not opening it, just setting it there. "Seeing as how you're talking about taking someone out of my property against her will." "Your property." Harlan repeated it flatly. "She walked in here 20 minutes ago. You don't know this girl." Garrett looked at the Zippo. He looked back up at Harlan. He turned the lighter over once with his fingers, a slow rotation, and set it back down. "Route 9, Garrett said. "Where you picked her up." "That's correct." "Route 9 heads south, out of town." She was on the shoulder heading. "County home is 30 miles north," Garrett said. His voice had not changed in volume or cadence. It remained level and quiet, each word placed deliberately, like stones being set one at a time. "County home is up on 395 north of Burns. Route 9 goes south, down toward the logging operations, down toward the Malheur River drainage, down toward about 40 square miles of timberland that doesn't see a lot of traffic after dark." He paused. Down toward that piece of private property you've got registered out near the old Kettner logging roads. The room changed. It was not a loud change. Nobody moved. Nothing was said. But something in the atmosphere of the Black Anvil Saloon shifted the way air shifts before lightning. A pressure differential. A change in the quality of the silence that every man in the room felt simultaneously. Decker had stopped leaning on the bar. He was standing straight now, both hands below the bar surface, out of sight. Briggs had moved without appearing to move, the way only certain kinds of men can, and he was now 3 feet closer to the door than he had been. Calloway and Etch had both turned fully in their chairs. Neither of them was looking at their cards. Harlan Greer's face did something complicated. The professional color, the managed authority, all of it drained away over approximately 2 seconds, and what replaced it was the pale quality of a man who has heard something said out loud that he had believed was known only to himself. He recovered quickly. He was practiced at recovery, but the 2 seconds had happened, and every man in the room who knew how to read another man had seen it. "You don't know what you're talking about," Harlan said. His voice was still controlled, but the warmth was entirely gone now, and what was underneath was cold and precise. "And you are dangerously close to making accusations you cannot back up in a county where I have been a sworn officer for 19 years. "I'm not making accusations," Garrett said quietly. "I'm describing geography." Harlan's hand moved to his holster, not drawing, just resting there. A placement rather than an action. A reminder of what was attached to his hip and what that meant. "I'm going to ask you one more time," Harlan said. "Step aside, let me do my job." The sound that followed was not loud, but in the silence of the bar, it carried the weight of a sound that changes the nature of a room. It was the sound of a pump-action shotgun being worked. A short, mechanical double click that was immediately recognizable to every person present for exactly what it was. Decker had produced the weapon from beneath the bar. He did not point it at Harlan. He rested the barrel on the surface of the bar, angled generally toward the middle of the room, and leaned his elbows on either side of it with the relaxed posture of a man taking a rest. "Just doing some maintenance," Decker said pleasantly. "Don't mind me." On Harlan's left, Briggs had stopped rolling the heavy brass lighter across his knuckles and was simply holding it, standing at a position that was not threatening in any obvious way, but that made the path to the door considerably more complicated than it had been. From the table near the window, the sound of chair legs on floorboards, low and deliberate, as Calloway and Etch stood and began moving with the unhurried certainty of men who knew the choreography. Harlan Greer was a man accustomed to being the largest presence in a room. He was discovering, in real time, that this particular room had a different accounting. He was alone. The backup he might have called for was 30 minutes away on a good night over county roads in October, and the men around him were not uncertain or excitable. They were calm in the way that dangerous men are calm, not because nothing was happening, but because what was happening was well within the range of things they had handled before. He looked at Garrett. Garrett had not moved. He had not raised his voice. He had not produced a weapon or made a threat. He simply sat in his corner booth with his hands on the table and his bourbon in front of him. And he looked at the deputy with the flat, patient, entirely unafraid gaze of a man who had been in worse rooms than this, on worse nights than this, and was still sitting upright. "You pull that weapon," Harlan said, directing it at Decker, his voice tight now, the control costing him something. "And you are signing your own—" "Nobody's pulling anything," Decker said. "I told you. Maintenance." Harlan's chest rose and fell. He looked at the door. He looked at the men between him and it. He looked back at Garrett. "This is kidnapping," he said. "You understand that. Harboring a runaway minor, that's a federal—" "She walked in here on her own," Garrett said. "With one shoe, running from you." He let that sit for a moment. Now, why would a ward of the state, a young girl in county custody, run from a law enforcement officer transporting her to safety and walk into a bar full of outlaws and hide behind the nearest man she could find? He paused again. "Makes a person wonder what she knows about Route 9, what she knows about the Kettner roads, what she might know about a certain piece of property with a cabin on it." He leaned forward very slightly. "The one with the deadbolts on the outside of the doors." The color that left Harlan Greer's face did not come back. He stood very still. His hand was still on the butt of his service weapon, But the quality of the gesture had changed entirely. It was no longer a reminder of authority. It was the hand of a man holding on to something because there was nothing else to hold. "You don't know," Harlan said very quietly. It was not an accusation. It was barely even a sentence. It was the sound of a man running a private calculation and not liking the result. "I know what Route 9 is for," Garrett said. "And I know what a girl looks like when she'd rather walk into a room full of men like us than spend another minute in a car with a man like you." He stood up then, coming out of the booth to his full height, which was considerable. He did not reach for anything. He simply stood up, and the weight of him in the room, the sheer physical fact of him, reorganized the space around the deputy. "You're going to take your hand off that sidearm. You're going to walk out of my bar, and you are not going to come back tonight." Harlan looked up at him. For a moment, the only sounds were the rain on the windows and the low hum of the jukebox and the breathing of the girl behind the booth. Then Harlan Greer removed his hand from his holster. He held both hands slightly away from his sides, a small, deliberate gesture of temporary withdrawal that was not surrender, but was as close to it as a man like him was going to come in a room like this. He looked at Garrett for a long moment with something that was not anger and was not fear, but was something more complicated than either. The look of a man filing something away for later use. "You can't keep her," Harlan said. It was the last thing he could say that still resembled authority, and he said it quietly. "She's in the system. There are processes. People will come looking." "Let them look," Garrett said. "But you won't be one of them. You come back to my property for any reason, I will make a phone call to the State Bureau of Investigation, and I will tell them to take a drive down the Kettner roads and have a look around." He let the silence do its work for a moment. "You understand me?" Harlan Greer understood him. He took one step back, then another. He did not look at Decker or Briggs or the other men. He kept his eyes on Garrett until he reached the door, and then he grabbed the handle and pushed through it into the wet October night. The door swung shut. Nobody moved. They listened. The sound of boots on gravel, fast now, not running but close to it. The slam of a car door. The engine firing and the transmission dropping into gear hard enough to throw gravel against the side of the building as the cruiser reversed and pulled out onto the county road. The red and blue sweeping across the windows one final time, and then the dark returned, and with it the sound of rain. Steady now, the advance scouts having delivered their report, the main event arriving. Garrett remained standing for a moment. He watched the door. He listened to the sound of the cruiser fading down the road until there was nothing left of it. Out in the parking lot, invisible from inside the bar, Harlan Greer sat in his cruiser with the engine idling and the radio off. He was not driving yet. He was sitting very still in the dark, processing what had just happened and what it meant for the sequence of decisions that would need to follow. He took his personal cell phone from the inside pocket of his jacket. He dialed a number he did not store under any identifying name. The call connected on the second ring. "She's with the Angels," Harlan said. His voice was flat and stripped of everything that had been in it inside the bar. "Call Dodd." He ended the call. He put the car in gear and pulled out onto the county road and drove south, away from the Black Anvil into the dark. Inside, none of them knew about the call. Garrett stood at the door and listened to the cruiser fade, and then turned back to the room. "Decker," he said. "Yeah. Lock it. Pull the shades." The deadbolt slid home with a sound like a vault engaging. The window shades came down one after another, cutting off the parking lot and the road and the dark beyond. The bar became a sealed space, its own small world, separate from the county outside and the man who had just left it. Garrett looked down. Chloe was still pressed into the corner of the booth, her knees pulled to her chest, her bare foot against the bench. She had released her grip on his vest without him noticing, and now her hands were in her lap, trembling at a frequency that was barely visible, a fine, persistent shaking like a tuning fork that has been struck and not yet stilled. She was looking up at him with eyes that were still wide, still working through the adrenaline, but different now. The pure animal terror had moved, become something more complicated, something that had room in it for question. Garrett knelt down. His bad knee registered the movement with a deep and familiar complaint, but he went down to her level and crouched there, keeping his distance. Not reaching for her, simply getting low enough that she wasn't looking up at him, and he wasn't looking down at her. "He's gone," Garrett said. It was not gentle. It was not comforting in any conventional sense. It was simply information, delivered in a flat and serious voice by a man who did not traffic in reassurances he could not back up. Car's gone. He's not coming back tonight. Chloe breathed. She looked at the door, at the pulled shades, back at Garrett. Her lip was still bleeding, a slow seep that she hadn't wiped. Why, she said. Her voice was barely there. Why did you do that? I don't like cops in my bar, Garrett said. He stood back up, the knee complaining again on the way. He looked across the room. Briggs, first aid kit from the back, wet bar towel and whatever ice is left. Briggs disappeared into the back hallway without comment. Garrett reached down and took Chloe by the collar of her torn denim jacket. Not roughly, but with the firm directional pressure of a man who has physically moved people before and understands the mechanics of it. He guided her up from the floor and steered her to the bench of the booth, sitting her down on the vinyl. She was extraordinarily light. The jacket and the denim were a considerable portion of her apparent mass. Under them, she was thin in the way that suggested the thinness had been going on for some time. She sat with her knees together, hands in her lap, looking at the table. She still had the one sneaker on. She had not taken it off, as though removing the last shoe would mean something she was not ready for it to mean. Briggs came back and set a battered red tackle box on the table. The bar's medical kit. He handed Chloe a white bar towel wrapped around a handful of ice and stepped back without ceremony. On your eye, Briggs said. His voice for a large man with a heavily inked neck was unexpectedly mild. Chloe took the ice pack with both hands and pressed it against the swollen right side of her face. She hissed through her teeth at the contact, but held it there. Garrett sat down across from her. He opened the tackle box and found the rubbing alcohol and a sleeve of cotton pads. He soaked one and set it on the table between them, on her side of the imaginary line that ran down the middle. The cut on your lip needs to be cleaned, he said. Your choice. You can do it or I can. She looked at the pad. She picked it up and pressed it against her split lip. Her eyes squeezed shut, and a single tear ran down from the corner of the uninjured eye, cut loose by the sting of the alcohol, a completely involuntary response to pain that she seemed embarrassed by when she opened her eyes again and found him still looking at her. He pulled me over on the shoulder, she said. She wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the cotton pad in her hand. Said I was past curfew. Put me in the back of the cruiser. She stopped, steadied something in her chest through visible effort. But he didn't go toward town. He turned onto the dirt roads. And I knew. She paused again, and the pause had weight in it. I knew because it wasn't the first time. The men in the bar were very quiet. The jukebox had moved into silence between songs, and no one had fed it another quarter. And so the only sound was the rain against the windows, and the girl's voice, and the occasional soft pop of the ice in the bar towel settling. I waited until he hit a pothole and the car slowed down. I kicked the door handle. It wasn't latching right on the inside. I kicked the frame until it gave, and I pushed the door open and I jumped. She said it matter-of-factly, the way people recount things they have already processed far enough that the words no longer surprise them. I rolled into the ditch. He stopped and came after me on foot. That's how I got hit. But I got up and I ran into the tree line, and I kept running until I couldn't hear him anymore. And then I followed the road with my eyes through the trees until I saw the lights from the highway, and I followed the highway until I saw your sign. Garrett poured a measure of bourbon into a clean shot glass and slid it across the table to her side. She looked at it. She picked it up and threw it back. She coughed hard, her eyes watering again, but she kept it down. After a few seconds, the shaking in her shoulders eased by a fraction. Garrett leaned back and crossed his arms. You can't stay here, he said. She looked up at him. Greer's a coward, but he's not done, Garrett said. Tonight he walks away because he doesn't have another play. But he'll regroup. He'll come back with paper and half the county behind him. He can't leave you out there, not if you know what you know about those roads. The brief stillness that had settled in Chloe's face broke. The terror shifted back in, a tide returning. You said you wouldn't let him take me. I said he wasn't taking you tonight. I meant it. Garrett reached into his vest pocket and produced a heavy ring of keys, which he set on the table between them. They hit the wood with a flat clatter. I'm riding up to Spokane, charter business. There's a woman there who runs a shelter strictly off the books, no paperwork, no records. She owes me more than one favor. Greer's jurisdiction ends at the county line. The people looking for you up there don't know your name. Chloe looked at the keys on the table. She looked at Garrett. You're taking me with you. I don't have a car, he said. He was already reaching for his riding jacket, heavy canvas and leather hanging from the hook at the end of the booth. You're on the back. It's 300 miles. It's cold and it's going to get colder and the rain isn't stopping. We don't pull over until we cross into Washington. He shrugged the jacket on. He looked down at her. The ice pack was still pressed to her face. Her bare foot was pale and cold-looking on the dark floor. You got a better offer? Garrett asked. Chloe looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the door with its pulled shade and the deadbolt that Decker had thrown. She looked around the bar at the men who had stood in the dark and held their ground between her and the uniform that had come for her. Men who were, by any legal definition, criminals. Men who bore the marks of a life lived outside the lines of what the county and the state and the law considered acceptable. She thought about Harlan Greer's face when Garrett had named the Kettner roads. She thought about the logging access road in the shape of a car turning south at midnight and the sound of a door she had not been able to open from the inside. She thought about what the word safety had meant at every point in her life and what it had actually delivered. She set the ice pack down on the table. She stood up. She straightened the torn denim jacket across her narrow shoulders. No, she said. I don't. 10 minutes later, the heavy oak door of the Black Anvil Saloon opened for the third time that night. The rain was falling steadily now, slicking the asphalt of the parking lot, beating on the chrome of the motorcycles lined up along the wall of the building. Garrett swung his leg over the Harley Road Glide. The machine was large and dark, customized over years into something that was more a reflection of its owner than a production vehicle. The paint matte and lightless, the chrome minimal and functional. He pressed the starter. The engine caught and came to life with the deep mechanical thunder that reverberated off the building and up through the ground and into the chest of anyone standing within 50 feet of it. He produced a spare helmet from the left saddlebag. Matte black, full face, too large. He handed it to Chloe. She put it on. It slid forward on her head, the forehead of the shell resting on the bridge of her nose. She pushed it back and held it there, looking at the bike. She climbed on behind him. She had to reach for the pegs, her legs not quite long enough to find them naturally. Her bare left foot rested on the cold metal of the peg with a careful deliberateness, as though she were setting it on ice. Hold on to my belt, Garrett said over the engine noise. Both hands, you let go, you're on the asphalt. I'm not doubling back. She wrapped both arms around his waist and locked her fingers on the heavy leather belt. She pressed her cheek against the back of his riding jacket. It smelled of oil and tobacco and the particular smell of leather that has been in rain before. Garrett put the bike in gear. The rear tire broke loose on the wet gravel for a half second before finding traction, and then the road glide rolled forward and hit the asphalt of the county road, and the engine note deepened as Garrett opened the throttle. The Black Anvil Saloon fell back behind them, the amber horseshoe in the window shrinking in the distance, and then the road curved north and it was gone. The rain came against them sideways, driven by the wind off the mountains, cold enough to sting any exposed skin. The headlight opened a tunnel in the dark ahead of them, the white line of the road's center dividing and passing beneath the wheels in a steady rhythm. Harney County fell away around them, the flat scrubland and the black outlines of juniper trees blurring into the peripheral dark as the speed built. Chloe kept her arms locked around Garrett's waist. She kept her cheek against his back. After a few miles, when the lights of the town were completely gone and there was nothing around them but the dark and the rain and the sound of the engine and the road, she closed her eyes. The wind came around the helmet and pressed against her. The cold was significant and real. The engine noise was total, filling every space where thought might otherwise have taken hold. For the first time in a very long time, with her arms locked around the waist of a violent and dangerous man riding north through the dark, Chloe stopped listening for footsteps behind her. She stopped calculating exits and distances, and what sounds carried through walls, and what a door handle felt like when the latch wasn't catching properly. She simply rode. And somewhere in the roar and the cold and the dark, something that had been wound unbearably tight inside her chest began, by the smallest possible degree, to loosen. Garrett rode north on US 395 and held it there, the road glide steady beneath him, the engine notes settling into the long, sustained tone of a machine doing what it was built for on open road. The rain came and went in the way of coastal weather moving inland, heavy for stretches, and then thin and cold and present without being dramatic. He checked the mirror every 90 seconds. Nothing behind them held its position through 3 consecutive checks. He let himself believe, provisionally, that Greer had gone back to his cruiser and his county road in whatever calculation he was making about the next move, and had not yet made that move. The highway climbed. Juniper gave way to pine, first scattered and then dense, the smell of them cutting through the rain and the exhaust, the temperature dropping a perceptible degree with every 500 feet of elevation. Chloe's grip had not loosened since Burns, but the quality of it had changed somewhere in the first hour. The desperate locked tension of someone holding on for survival, becoming something more settled, more functional. The grip of a person who had accepted that this was the situation and was now simply inside it. He had been riding for 40 minutes when he found the pull-off at Burns Junction, a concrete apron in front of a gas station and convenience store combination that operated 24 hours because it was the only fuel stop for 60 miles in either direction, and the trucking companies had long ago made it economically viable. The fluorescent lights above the pumps were hard and white in the dark, making the rain visible as a silver curtain falling through the brightness. Garrett pulled up to the pump farthest from the road and cut the engine. The silence that followed was profound. After the sustained roar of the motorcycle, the absence of it was almost physical. A pressure change. The rain ticked against the concrete and against the gas station's metal canopy. Somewhere inside the building, a radio was playing something indistinct. Chloe unlocked her hands and straightened up. She pulled the oversized helmet off and held it in her lap, blinking in the fluorescent light, her hair compressed flat on one side from the time inside the shell. She looked at her left foot and flexed it carefully on the peg, testing sensation. Garrett watched her do it. He swung off the bike and fed the pump with cash from his wallet, then unscrewed the Harley's tank cap. He looked at her over the roof of the pump housing. "Go inside, get something hot, coffee, soup, whatever they have. Tell them to put it on the pump with the road glide." She climbed off the bike carefully, her bare foot touching the concrete with an involuntary small sound at the cold of it. She tucked the helmet under her arm and went into the store without speaking. Garrett watched her go. He watched the glass door swing shut behind her and then turned back to the pump, listening to the fuel run into the tank, looking at the highway behind them. The road was empty in both directions. The rain fell through the light above him and hit the concrete and ran in thin streams toward the drainage channel at the edge of the apron. Nothing moved on the highway. He held the pump handle and thought about the 2 seconds. The moment after he had named the Kettner roads in the cabin, those particular 2 seconds in which Harlan Greer's professional mask had slipped and something pale and fundamental had shown through. That was not the reaction of a man being falsely accused. That was not indignation or offense. That was recognition. That was a man hearing something he knew to be true spoken aloud in a room he had not expected it to be spoken in. Garrett had heard the rumor about the cabin from a man named Dewey Stokes, who ran a timber brokerage out of Burns and who drank at the Black Anvil 4 or 5 times a year when his business brought him through Harney County. Stokes had mentioned it obliquely, the way men mention things they are not comfortable knowing directly, as part of a longer conversation about the general corruption of county law enforcement. Something about Greer's transports taking longer than the distance warranted. Something about a contractor out near the Kettner operation who had noticed vehicles on the private logging roads at hours that didn't make sense for anything legitimate. Garrett had filed it away the way he filed most things, not acting on it, simply holding it in the same mental drawer where he kept information that might one day be relevant. He had not known, when he pulled that drawer open tonight, how precisely it would land. He had known enough to know it was a real thing he was aiming at. The 2 seconds had confirmed the rest. The pump clicked off. He replaced the nozzle and screwed the tank cap back on and went inside. The store was warm and smelled of burned coffee and microwave food. Chloe was standing at the small counter near the back where a coffee station and a rotating rack of hot food items occupied the wall. She had found a pair of thick wool socks in the small clothing section near the door and was wearing them, the sneaker back on her right foot, the left foot now covered. She was holding a paper cup of coffee with both hands and staring at the rotating rack without appearing to see it. Garrett went to the counter, spoke to the young man behind the register, and added the socks and a package hand warmer to the pump total. He went back to where Chloe was standing. She looked at the hand warmer when he held it out. "Crack it," he said. She cracked it and shook it and held it in the hand that wasn't holding the coffee cup. Some of the rigidity in her shoulders eased almost immediately, the warmth working faster than she had expected. They stood at the coffee counter in the hard fluorescent light of the Burns Junction stop, and Garrett poured himself a cup of coffee that was probably 4 hours old and didn't much care. He drank half of it standing there. "I need to know something," he said. He said it without preamble, without softening it into a question. He said it the way he said most things, as a statement of where the conversation was going. Chloe looked at the side of his face. "Greer came after you specifically tonight," Garrett said. "Not a general patrol pickup. He found you on Route 9 heading in a specific direction, and he put you in his car, and he didn't go toward town. That's not standard." He drank the rest of his coffee. "Why you? What does he want from you specifically?" Chloe wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. She looked at the rotating rack again for a moment. A packaged burrito turned slowly behind the glass. Then she set her coffee cup down on the counter. She reached into the left sneaker, the one on her right foot, and worked her fingers into the space between the inner sole and the heel. She peeled back the thin foam insert and removed a cell phone. It was a cheap, prepaid model, the kind sold at convenience stores and gas stations, small and light with a cracked corner on the screen. She held it for a moment before setting it on the counter between them. "3 weeks ago," she said, "I was in a placement on the south side of Burns. Group home. Harlan was there sometimes, talking to the house supervisor. I didn't know what that was about, but the other kids said he came around regular." Garrett looked at the phone on the counter. He didn't pick it up. "There was a girl at the home," Chloe continued, "younger than me, 12, maybe 13. She was there one day and gone the next, and nobody would say where she went or why. The house supervisor said she'd been transferred to another facility." She stopped. Her jaw was set. "But I'd seen her the night before she disappeared. She was scared. Not nervous scared. Scared the way you get when you already know what's coming and you can't stop it." Another pause. "I know that kind of scared." Garrett was looking at her now. "I followed Harlan's cruiser 2 nights later when I saw it come down our street after midnight. I followed it on foot as far as I could, and then I lost it on the paved road. But I saw which way it turned. And I knew from the other kids that there was something out on those logging roads that nobody talked about." She picked up the phone. She turned it on, waited for the screen to brighten, and navigated to the photos. She turned it so Garrett could see the screen. He looked at the images. They were taken through a small window, partially obscured by grime, and the angle of the phone held at arm's reach in poor light, and some of them were blurred. But enough of them were clear. Interior of a small structure. Bare wooden walls. A cot against one wall with a thin mattress and no bedding. A padlock and latch visible on the inside of the door. A battery-powered lantern on a wooden shelf. A child's shoe on the floor near the cot. Garrett looked at each image for a long time. He looked at all of them. You were at the cabin, he said. It was not a question. I found it 3 weeks ago, Chloe said. I walked out to the Kettner roads from the county road. Took me most of a night. I got close enough to take the pictures through the window before I heard his car coming down the access road. I ran. I don't think he saw me. She took the phone back. I didn't know what to do with them. I was trying to figure out who I could give them to that would actually do something and not just hand me back to Harlan. He didn't come after you for 3 weeks, Garrett said. He was not questioning this. He was fitting pieces together in the way of a man accustomed to assembling incomplete information into workable pictures. He didn't know I had pictures, she said. I don't think he knew I was at the cabin at all until last week. I lost my school library card somewhere near the access road. I didn't know I dropped it until it was too late. After that, he started circling. There it was, the thing that made the timeline cohere. A library card with a name on it, found on a logging road where no student had any legitimate reason to be. A deputy who understood exactly what that meant. A week of watching her, following her movements, waiting for the right moment on the right road with no witnesses. Garrett stood at the counter and looked at the phone in her hand and understood the full scope of what he had walked into tonight. He had told himself it was simpler, a girl running from a bad cop. He got her out of the county and handed her to people who could manage it from there. That was the extent of it. That was the cost he was willing to absorb. But this was not that. This was a girl holding evidence of something serious enough that the man it could destroy had decided to permanently remove her rather than risk it. This was not a local deputy covering his own misconduct and hoping it stayed quiet. This was someone who had already decided that the cost of a missing girl was lower than the cost of what she knew. He was thinking through this, standing at the counter of the Burns Junction stop with 4-hour-old coffee in a paper cup, when the bell above the door chimed. He did not turn immediately. He moved his eyes to the convex security mirror mounted in the corner above the door and looked at the reflection. A man had come in. He was wearing civilian clothes, dark pants, and a canvas work coat, and he was carrying nothing visibly. He went to the far end of the store and appeared to examine the packaged food items on the shelf there. He was not looking at Garrett or Chloe. He was not looking at them with the deliberateness that people achieve when they are working not to look at something. Garrett picked up his coffee cup. He turned slightly and looked at the man's reflection and then at the parking lot visible through the glass door. A dark pickup truck was parked at the far end of the lot, away from the pumps, facing out toward the highway. Not a local configuration. Someone who had driven in off the highway and positioned their vehicle to leave quickly had parked that way. He had not been behind them when Garrett left Burns. He had not been visible at any point on the ride north. He had been waiting here. Garrett set his empty cup on the counter. He took Chloe by the elbow, not roughly, and steered her toward the back of the store where a hallway led to the restrooms and a secondary exit. We're going out the back, he said quietly. Don't stop. Don't look at the man by the shelves. Go directly to the bike. She went without asking why. Garrett walked her through the hallway and out the side door and around the building in the rain. He reached the road glide 30 seconds ahead of what he had estimated and got Chloe mounted and the engine running before the man from the store had time to process that they were no longer inside. He pulled out of the station lot and turned north on the highway, opened the throttle and watched his mirror. The dark pickup pulled out of the lot 40 seconds later. Garrett had been watching for it, and still the cold confirmation hit with its own particular weight. He was not being paranoid. He was being followed, and had been followed for some portion of the night, and the person doing the following had known their destination well enough to set up ahead of them rather than chase behind. He rode north for 6 miles and then took a county access road east, into the trees, a road he knew from previous runs that wound back through private timberland and reconnected with the highway 4 miles north. It was unpaved, washboard, difficult in the wet and dark. He took it at a speed that was unreasonable for the conditions and that he could manage because he had ridden it before. The pickup did not follow. It stayed on the highway. Garrett came back out onto the paved road 4 miles north of where he had left it and rode for another 3 miles before pulling off onto a wide gravel shoulder beneath a stand of pines that provided enough canopy to cut the rain. He stopped the engine. He got off the bike and stood in the dark and listened. The highway was empty, no headlights. The wind moved through the pines above him and the rain fell in the spaces between the branches, and the smell was cold and clean and completely absent of anything mechanical. After 90 seconds, he was satisfied. He reached into the inner pocket of his riding jacket and produced his phone. He dialed Decker. It rang twice. You clear? Decker said. We had a tail, Garrett said. Civilian vehicle. Set up ahead of us at Burns Junction, not behind. Somebody knew our general direction before we left. A short silence on Decker's end. The kind of silence that is not empty but is a man thinking through implications. Greer made a call from the lot, Decker said. I figured as much when I heard the car pull out fast. Not just Greer, Garrett said. Whoever was in that pickup, they weren't county. No law enforcement posture. No identifying plates. Wrong vehicle profile. Somebody private. He looked at the highway. Greer called someone above him. Someone with enough reach to put a private asset on the road in under 2 hours. Another silence. Dodd, Decker said. It was not a guess. Sheriff Warren Dodd had run Harney County for going on 14 years. He was not a figure that Garrett thought about often, because Dodd had operated on the understanding that the Black Anvil Charter occupied a particular niche in the county economy, and that niche, while technically illegal in several respects, was not worth the resources it would cost to dismantle. And so the two entities had observed a long and mutually understood distance from each other. Garrett paid no tribute and asked for no protection, and stayed out of anything that drew the kind of attention that reflected badly on the county. Dodd asked no questions and kept his deputies from conducting the kind of thorough traffic stops that would yield difficult results. It was not an alliance. It was a mutual recognition of inconvenient reality. It had held for 11 years. It was apparently no longer holding. Chloe had climbed off the bike and was standing beside him in the dark under the pines, the hand warmer in one fist, listening to him on the phone without appearing to listen. She was good at that. She had the quality of someone who had spent years in environments where adults conducted conversations they did not want children to hear, and who had learned to make herself acoustically invisible while remaining entirely present and attentive. I need Spokane activated, Garrett said. Full response. I need them on the Washington side of the state line at the 84 junction, no later than 3 hours from now. That's a big ask on 2 hours' notice, Decker said. Callaway has the Spokane president's personal number. Use it. Tell him it's a presidential request. Understood. A pause. How bad is this, Garrett? Garrett looked at Chloe in the dark under the pines. She was looking back at him steadily, the phone light catching her face, the bruise on her cheek still dark and angry, the wool sock on her bare foot showing at the bottom of the torn jeans. She was not afraid right now. She was watchful. It was a different thing entirely. The girl has photographs, Garrett said, from inside Greer's cabin on the Kettner roads. Documentation of what he's been doing out there. A very long silence on Decker's end. Understood, Decker said again. His voice had changed register slightly. Spokane gets activated. Anything else? Keep the bar dark tonight. Don't let anyone in or out until I call. He ended the call and put the phone away. He stood under the pines and listened to the highway for another moment. Still nothing. The rain came down in the spaces between the branches and hit the pine needles with a soft, constant sound. He looked at Chloe. Dodd, she said. She had not heard the name spoken on his end. She said it because she had been listening to the shape of his half of the conversation the way a person reads a room from a doorway, assembling what she could not hear from what she could. Tell me about him, Garrett said. The kids in the group home talked about him, she said. Not directly, sideways, the way they talked about Harlan, like he was something that was just there, like the weather. Harlan reported to Dodd. Whatever Harlan was doing on those roads, Dodd knew about it. She paused. Maybe more than knew. Garrett absorbed this. He had suspected the second part from the moment the private vehicle had appeared in his mirror. A deputy operating a private cabin for the purposes suggested by what Chloe had photographed did not sustain that operation for any meaningful period without protection from above. It was too logistically complex, too potentially visible, too dependent on the management of county resources, including transport and paperwork, and the handling of missing child reports. None of that happened without authorization that came from higher than a road deputy. He looked at his phone. He thought about the State Bureau of Investigation, the threat he had leveled at Harlan Greer and the Black Anvil, the phone call to a contact there. He had that contact. The contact was real. But a call to the SBI from Garrett Mace, president of a Hells Angels charter, reporting that Harney County's sheriff was involved in the exploitation of minors, was a call that would need to be handled very carefully and would move very slowly. because the first thing any investigator would do was examine the credibility and motivation of the source. And the source was not ideal. He needed something cleaner than that. He needed the evidence in Chloe's phone to reach someone who could act on it without the entire chain of custody running through a biker with a record. He put the phone back in his pocket and got back on the motorcycle. "Get on," he said. She climbed on behind him. She found the pegs without being told and locked her arms around his waist, and he felt her press her cheek against the back of his jacket, the same configuration as before. He started the engine. Before he pulled back onto the highway, he sat for a moment with the engine running, the headlight illuminating the wet asphalt of the access road and the curtain of rain beyond it. He was thinking about the dark pickup and the junction ahead and the Spokane charter moving south in response to his call, and he was thinking about Harlan Greer's face in the 2 seconds after he named the Kettner roads, and he was thinking about what Chloe had said about the younger girl who was there one day and gone the next. He was also thinking, in the quieter part of his mind, about another night 12 years ago, when he had stood in a different parking lot in a different rain and made a different calculation. His daughter had been 8 years old. She had her mother's eyes and his stubbornness, and she had looked at him from the back seat of a social worker's car with an expression that was not angry and was not begging and was simply waiting to see what he was going to do. He had let the car pull away. He had told himself it was the right thing, that he couldn't give her what she needed, that the life he ran was no place for a child, that she would be better with a stable placement, with people who weren't answerable to a charter and a road and the particular violent geography of the world he occupied. He had told himself this for 12 years, with the consistency of a man rehearsing testimony, and on most nights it almost worked. He looked in his mirror. The highway was empty. He pulled out and headed north. They rode for another hour without stopping. The highway climbed and descended through the pine-covered hills of eastern Oregon, the wet road throwing back the headlight in long silver reflections, the rain easing gradually to the fine cold mist that preceded a break. Garrett rode at a pace that was fast enough to cover ground and measured enough to let him watch the mirror without distraction. Nothing came behind them. The dark pickup had not reappeared. He was 3 miles from the state line when he saw it. Not behind, ahead. 2 vehicles parked on the right shoulder, positioned partially across the travel lane, their headlights on but their emergency flashers not running. Not a breakdown configuration. A blocking one. Garrett eased the throttle back and brought the road glide down to a speed where he could read the situation without committing to any particular response. His eyes moved from the vehicles to the tree line on either side of the road and back to the vehicles. He counted 2 men visible in the headlight glare, standing between the parked trucks, not in front of them, not behind them, standing in the lane itself. He felt Chloe's arms tighten. She had seen them too. Garrett brought the bike to a stop approximately 100 yards from the blockade and put both feet on the wet asphalt. He killed the headlight. In the sudden dark, the scene ahead was lit only by the parked truck's headlights and the cold ambient light of the overcast sky. He could see the men more clearly now. Dark clothing, no visible law enforcement markings on the vehicles, no light bars, no county insignia. Private. The same profile as the truck at Burns Junction, scaled up. He sat very still on the idling motorcycle and looked at what was in front of him. There were 4 of them, 2 visible between the trucks. 2 more he had identified near the tree line on the left shoulder, visible only as shapes against darker shapes. They were not attempting concealment. They wanted to be seen. This was not an ambush. This was a message about the cost of continuing. Behind him, Chloe's breathing had changed. He felt it against his back, the rhythm tightening, the control she had been maintaining for the last 2 hours beginning to strain at the seams. She had been very steady. She had held it together well past what could be expected. But they were stopped in the dark on a mountain highway, with men blocking the road ahead. And she had been running since before she hit the door of the Black Anvil. And even the stubbornness that a person develops in survival mode has a floor. He reached back with his right hand and found her forearm where it crossed his waist. He pressed it once, a brief firm pressure, and then returned his hand to the handlebar. Not comfort, information. He was here. He had seen what she was seeing. He was not surprised by it, and he was not afraid of it, and the situation was not yet resolved. He took his phone out. He looked at the time. He had asked for Spokane at the state line junction in 3 hours. He had made that call 45 minutes ago. That meant Spokane was still more than 2 hours out, minimum if they had mobilized immediately, which they might not have. He was 3 miles from the state line with 4 men between him and it. He could turn around, ride back south, pick an alternate crossing point, add 4 hours to the trip, and hope Dodd's reach didn't extend to covering every reasonable route. That was one calculation. He could try to go around this blockade, into the tree line, on terrain that would destroy the bike, or dump it within 50 yards. That was another calculation with a poor expected outcome. Or he could sit here and hold the situation exactly where it was and wait for the arithmetic to change in his favor. He was working through this when his phone vibrated. Decker. He answered. "Spokane's running early," Decker said. 14 bikes. They left an hour ago, just called in. They're running fast. They'll be at the junction in 40 minutes. Garrett looked at the men on the road ahead. 40 minutes was not a small amount of time in the current configuration, but it was a real number. "Tell them to come south of the line," Garrett said. "Oregon side, 3 miles south of the junction." He ended the call. He sat on the idling motorcycle in the rain-dampened dark with his feet on the wet road and looked at the men ahead and did what he was particularly good at, which was waiting without the waiting becoming something visible that the other party could read and use. He let 40 minutes pass. It was among the longest stretches of time he could remember sitting through. The men at the roadblock did not approach. They stood in the configuration they had set and watched him and waited for him to make a decision. He did not give them one. He sat on the bike with the engine idling and the headlight off, and he held the situation exactly where it was, spending nothing, committing to nothing, simply occupying the space between them with a patience that had no visible bottom. Chloe did not speak. She had found, somewhere in those 40 minutes, the same kind of stillness he was demonstrating. Her arms were around his waist and her forehead was against his back, and she was enduring the time in the way she had clearly learned to endure things, by not spending energy on what she could not change and conserving it for the moment when something could be done. He heard the Spokane charter before the headlights appeared. The sound came from the north, from the Washington side, rolling down the mountain and reaching them before any visual did. It was not the sound of one motorcycle or two, it was the sound of a mass of them, 14 engines and the overlapping acoustic signature of a group of Harleys running in proximity on an open road. It filled the mountain corridor and bounced off the tree lines and came down the highway like something enormous moving through a confined space. The headlights crested the rise to the north. 14 beams spread wide across the travel lane, the charter running two abreast, moving south in a column that stretched back beyond the rise. The lead bikes came over the state line at speed, and the headlights illuminated the scene ahead of them, caught the two parked trucks and the 4 men between them in the full combined brightness of 14 halogen beams. The men at the roadblock were suddenly very visible and very exposed. Garrett watched them from 100 yards south, and he watched what the sound and the light did to the calculation they were making. These private contractors hired on short notice by a county official, standing on a mountain highway at 1 in the morning with a column of motorcycles bearing down on them from the north, and their target stationary to the south, and no version of the situation in front of them that resolved cleanly. The Spokane lead rider, a man named Harwick, who had run the charter for 9 years and had a direct and uncomplicated approach to tactical situations, slowed the column to a stop approximately 30 yards north of the blockade. He killed his engine. 14 engines died in sequence behind him. In the sudden silence, the sound of the rain was very loud. Harwick put his feet on the ground and looked at the men between the trucks with the quality of attention that communicated, without any words being required, a comprehensive understanding of the arithmetic. The men at the blockade held their position for approximately 20 seconds. Then the two from the tree line walked back to the vehicles. Then the two in the lane stepped aside. The trucks started their engines and one of them moved forward and the other reversed, and the road was open. They drove south without stopping. Garrett started his headlight. He put the road glide in gear and rode forward. He passed the position the trucks had occupied, the tire marks still visible on the road shoulder, and brought the bike to a stop beside Harwick. Harwick looked at him with the expression of a man who has driven 40 minutes at speed through mountain rain at 1 in the morning and considers this a reasonable Tuesday. "President," Harwick said. "Harwick," Garrett said. He looked at the highway behind them, south, where the taillights of the two trucks were disappearing around a curve. "I need an escort to Spokane, and I need you to call ahead to the Pratt woman on the east side." "Already done," Harwick said. "Decker called it in when he called us." He looked at Chloe briefly. without changing expression. She's ready. Garrett put the bike in gear. They crossed into Washington State, 14 bikes strong, the column spreading across the highway, the sound of them rolling north through the mountain dark like something that had been held back and released. The rain had stopped. Above the tree line to the east, the overcast was beginning to thin, and in one place near the horizon, through a gap in the clouds, a single star was briefly visible before the gap closed again. Chloe watched it from behind Garrett's shoulder. She watched the star disappear and kept her arms locked around his waist and her cheek against the leather of his jacket. And she was thinking about the phone in her shoe and the photographs on it and the younger girl and the cot against the bare wooden wall and the child's shoe on the floor. She was thinking about what she had done 3 weeks ago at the Burns Public Library on the only afternoon she had managed to get there without supervision. She had not told Garrett yet. She had been carrying it the way she had carried the phone in her shoe, held close, waiting for the right moment, waiting to understand whether the moment had arrived. She thought about the email she had sent from the library's public terminal, the address she had found in an archived newspaper, the photographs she had attached, the message she had written herself in the careful, controlled language she used when she needed to be taken seriously by people who did not yet know they should take her seriously. She thought about whether the right moment had arrived. She thought it probably had. She kept her arms around Garrett's waist and watched the road coming north beneath them, and she let the moment wait just a little longer, because there was value in knowing something that the people trying to stop you did not know you knew. And she had learned a long time ago to hold that value carefully and spend it only when the spending would count for something real. The Spokane lights appeared on the horizon ahead of them, the city's ambient glow warming the underside of the clouds, and the column of motorcycles rode toward it through the clear, cold air of the early mountain morning. Spokane appeared on the horizon the way cities do when you approach them from the dark of open country, not as a sudden thing, but as a gradual warming of the sky, the accumulated light of 100,000 windows and street lamps pressing upward against the underside of the clouds and staining them amber. The column of motorcycles rode toward that warmth with the purposefulness of men who have been moving through cold and dark for long enough that arrival has become something they can feel in the chest before it is visible to the eye. Garrett rode at the front of the column with Harwick one bike length to his right, and behind them the Spokane charter filled the northbound lane in a formation that communicated something specific to anyone who observed it. 14 bikes in close formation, running two abreast, and behind the noise and the light, there was a weight to it that had nothing to do with the machines themselves, the weight of men who understand obligation and do not require it to be explained to them. Chloe had not spoken since the highway above the state line. She had ridden the last 40 minutes in the same configuration she had maintained for most of the night, arms locked around Garrett's waist, cheek against his jacket, but something in the quality of her stillness had changed. Earlier, it had been the stillness of someone enduring. Now it was the stillness of someone thinking, of someone running through a private calculation with the focused attention of a person who understands that the next decision they make will matter in ways the previous ones had not. Garrett felt it. He could not have explained specifically how he felt it, only that in his experience the quality of a person's grip changes when their mind moves from reaction to intention, and hers had changed somewhere in the mountains south of the line. Harwick led them off the interstate and through the eastern grid of the city, through streets that were empty at this hour except for the occasional delivery truck and the insomniac pedestrians that cities produce at 2 in the morning. The neighborhoods changed as they moved east, the commercial strips giving way to residential blocks, the houses getting smaller and older and more widely spaced as the streetlights grew less frequent. They turned onto a road that ran alongside a drainage channel and followed it for half a mile before Harwick slowed and pulled into the driveway of a large house set back from the street behind a row of mature arborvitae that screened it effectively from the road. The house was old and well-maintained in the way of buildings that are cared for by people who understand that maintenance is a form of dignity. White clapboard siding, a deep covered porch, windows lit from within by the warm light of a space that was awake and expecting them. A gravel parking area ran along the left side of the house, and Harwick pulled in and killed his engine, and behind him the column did the same in sequence, the sound dying bike by bike until the night was quiet, and the only sounds were the ticking of cooling engines and the soft movement of wind in the arborvitae. A woman came out onto the porch. She was in her early 60s, compact and direct in her bearing, with white hair cut short and the kind of face that has been weathered by sustained purpose rather than by hardship, a distinction that is visible if you know how to read it. She wore a canvas jacket over a flannel shirt, and she stood at the top of the porch steps without the hesitation of someone who has been woken, because she had not been woken. She had been waiting. Her name was Ruth Daly, and she had been operating the shelter for 11 years out of this house and two adjacent properties she owned on the same block. And in those 11 years, she had never advertised her location in any directory or database, and had never accepted a referral from any government agency, and had never once called the police for any reason. She had a network of her own, composed of women and a few men who had learned over time that the formal systems for protecting vulnerable people had gaps in them that were not accidental, and she had built something that operated in those gaps. She looked at Garrett when he came up the porch steps, and then she looked past him at Chloe, who was still carrying the oversized helmet under her arm and wearing the wool socks and the single sneaker and the torn denim jacket that had started the night in considerably better condition. Ruth looked at the bruise on Chloe's face and the split lip and the bare right foot now covered in wool, and her expression did not change because she had seen this before. This exact configuration of damage and exhaustion and the quality of alertness that exists in a person who has been running long enough that the running has become a condition rather than an action. "Come inside," Ruth said. She said it to Chloe directly, not to Garrett. Chloe looked at Garrett. He nodded once. She went up the steps and followed Ruth through the door, and it closed behind them, and Garrett stood on the porch and listened to the muffled sounds of the house receiving her. Footsteps in a low voice and the sound of a kettle being set on a stove. He stood there for a moment. Then he went back down the steps and stood with Harwick in the gravel beside the bikes. The Spokane men had spread out along the parking area with the ease of people accustomed to waiting in configurations like this. Some sitting on their bikes, some standing, none of them with any visible impatience. Garrett and Harwick stood together without speaking for a moment. "Dodd," Garrett said. It was not a question, and it was not a request for confirmation. It was simply the word being placed between them so they could both look at it. "Word came through 2 hours ago that Dodd had put out a private contract," Harwick said. "We figured it was related when Decker called. The man has reach into eastern Washington. Not as much as he thinks, but some." "The reach stops now," Garrett said. Harwick looked at him with the calm, assessing attention of a man who wants to understand the specific weight of a statement before agreeing to it. "What are we working with?" "The girl has photographs," Garrett said, "from inside a structure on Greer's operation out on the Kettner roads. Documentation solid enough to open a federal investigation if it gets to the right people through the right channel." Harwick was quiet for a moment. "What channel?" "I don't know yet," Garrett said. "I need to talk to her." He went back up onto the porch. He knocked on the doorframe and Ruth appeared, and he told her he needed 5 minutes with Chloe before anything else happened. Ruth looked at him in the measuring way she had, determining whether this was a reasonable request, and apparently determined that it was, because she opened the door and led him through a warm hallway that smelled of bread and old wood into a kitchen where Chloe was sitting at a heavy wooden table with a mug of tea and a plate of toast that she had not yet touched. Ruth left them and closed the door to the hallway. Garrett sat down across from Chloe. He put his phone on the table between them, face down. He looked at her. "Before anything else gets decided," he said, "I need to know everything." Chloe looked at the toast. She picked it up and took a small, careful bite and chewed it, and he understood that she was buying herself a moment, not to delay but to organize. "3 weeks ago," she said, "I was at the Burns Public Library. I had a free afternoon, which didn't happen often. I used one of the public computers." She set the toast down. "I found her, the woman I sent the photos to." Garrett's attention shifted in a specific way, the way a man's attention shifts when information arrives that is structurally more important than everything preceding it. "Nora Pratt," Chloe said. "She writes for the Portland Tribune, investigative work. I found her name in an archived article from 4 years ago about corruption in 3 Oregon counties. She had written about a case in Douglas County where a deputy had been using his position to transport minors across county lines. She got the story published and the man was prosecuted." She looked at Garrett steadily. She knew what she was looking for. She'd looked for it before. Garrett said nothing. He let her continue. "I emailed her from the library terminal," Chloe said. "I sent all the photographs. I wrote her a summary of what I knew, where the cabin was, what I'd seen regarding the younger girl, and what I believed Harlan Greer was doing on those roads, and who I believe was authorizing it. She paused. I told her I didn't know how long I had before Greer figured out I'd been at the cabin. I asked her to hold the material until she heard from me confirming it was safe to move forward. She responded. That same night, she said she had received the material and had reviewed it, and that it was sufficient to begin an inquiry. She said she had a contact at the FBI field office in Portland who handled cases involving minors and public officials. Chloe wrapped both hands around the mug of tea. She said she would wait for my confirmation call, but she also said that if she did not hear from me within 30 days, she would proceed anyway based on what she had. Garrett sat with this. 3 weeks ago, a 16-year-old girl in a group home in Burns, Oregon, with a cheap prepaid phone and one unsupervised afternoon, had done something that most adults in her situation would not have known to do and would not have had the composure to execute even if they had known. She had identified the right person, assembled the available evidence, constructed a coherent written account, and established a protocol that would function even in the event of her own disappearance. He looked at her across the heavy wooden table, and she looked back at him with the level, careful attention she had maintained through the entire night. And he understood something about her that he had been assembling in pieces since she came through the door of the Black Anvil and crossed the room directly to him. She had not survived this long by luck or by accident. She had survived by being considerably more strategic than anyone in her situation had given her credit for. You need to call her now, Garrett said. Tonight, before Dodd has time to build a legal structure around what he tried to do on that highway. I know, Chloe said. She reached into the left sneaker. The phone was still there. She dialed from memory. The number had been in her head for 3 weeks. It rang 4 times and then the line opened and a woman's voice came through, alert and not groggy. The voice of a person who slept lightly or not much, and said her name. This is Chloe, Chloe said. From Burns. I'm in Spokane. I'm safe. A pause. It's time. The silence on the other end lasted approximately 2 seconds, the silence of a person shifting from one state of readiness to another. Are you able to talk? Nora Pratt said. Yes. Is there anyone with you who I should know about? Chloe looked at Garrett. There's a man named Garrett Mace. He got me out of Harney County tonight. Harlan Greer tried to intercept us on Highway 84 before the state line. There were 4 men blocking the road. Private contractors, not law enforcement. Another brief silence. Garrett could hear the faint sound of something being written. That's significant, Nora Pratt said, and her voice had changed in the way that a journalist's voice changes when a story they have been holding carefully suddenly develops a weight that was not there before. That puts Dodd in direct operational involvement, not just passive authorization. That changes the federal exposure considerably. I know, Chloe said. I'm going to make 2 calls in the next 10 minutes, Nora said. One to my editor, one to my contact at the FBI field office. Given what you've just told me about tonight, I think we move to a federal level directly rather than going through the state first. Oregon State Police would have to coordinate with the county initially, and that chain has too many opportunities for Dodd to manage the information before it reaches people he doesn't control. Okay, Chloe said. Chloe. The journalist's voice took on a quality that was not softer, exactly, but more direct. The quality of a person choosing to speak plainly because plainness is a form of respect. You did this correctly. The way you documented it, the way you established the backup protocol. You did this better than most adults would have. Chloe said nothing for a moment. The girl from the group home, she said finally. The younger one. She's my first call to the field office, Nora Pratt said. I promise you that. The call ended. Chloe set the phone on the table. She looked at it. She looked at Garrett. He was looking at her with the same flat, attentive gaze he had turned on her all night. But something in it had shifted by a degree that would not have been visible to anyone who did not know how to read him. It was not softness. It was something closer to acknowledgement. The recognition that passes between people when one of them has done something that the other considers genuinely difficult and genuinely right. Harwick, Garrett said. He stood up and went to the hallway door and opened it and called the name down toward the front of the house. Harwick appeared in the kitchen doorway 30 seconds later. I need you to contact every charter between here and Portland, Garrett said. I need word to move through the network that Warren Dodd of Harney County is being named in a federal inquiry involving the exploitation of minors. I need that information moving before sunrise. He looked at Harwick steadily, not as a threat, as a record, so that if anything happens to the girl or to the journalist she contacted, there is already a documented trail that leads back to Dodd that exists outside any system he has access to. Harwick nodded once. He left the kitchen. Garrett sat back down. He poured himself a cup of tea from the pot on the table because it was there, and because it was hot, and he had been cold for several hours. He drank it without appearing to notice what it was. They sat in the kitchen of Ruth Daly's house in Spokane, and the quiet of the early morning settled around them, and neither of them felt the need to fill it with words, because they had covered a considerable amount of ground together in the past several hours, and were both the kind of people who understood that some things do not require commentary. After a while, Ruth came back into the kitchen and looked at Chloe with the practical, non-intrusive attention of a woman who has assessed need many times. "There's a room ready," Ruth said. "Clean clothes. Hot water if you want it." Chloe looked at Garrett. He picked up his tea. "Go," he said. She stood up. She took the prepaid phone from the table and held it. She looked at Garrett in the way she had looked at him several times over the course of the night, with the complicated assessment of someone recalibrating what they know about another person against the evidence currently in front of them. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply and without decoration, the way people say things they mean without qualification. Garrett drank his tea. He did not look up. She followed Ruth out of the kitchen, and he listened to their footsteps on the stairs, and then to the muffled sounds of the house, a door, water running, the quiet that exists when a building is settling in around people who have finally stopped moving. He sat alone in the kitchen for a while. He thought about the road. He thought about the state line and the four men who had been standing in it, and what it had cost Dodd to put them there. The degree to which a man in Dodd's position had chosen to make the situation worse rather than let it resolve. That escalation was information. It told him that the photographs Chloe carried were significant enough to destroy something that Dodd could not afford to lose. Significant enough that he had decided the risk of an active interdiction on a state highway was preferable to the risk of letting the evidence reach the wrong eyes. Men made that calculation wrong sometimes. Dodd had made it tonight. The interdiction had failed, the evidence was in the hands of a journalist with a federal contact, and now there was a chain of knowledge running through the Spokane charter, and beyond that, could not be untangled without creating exactly the kind of attention that Dodd most needed to avoid. He also thought about his club, about the investigation that Dodd had apparently managed to initiate before the night ended, the preliminary inquiry into the charter that would require time and lawyers, and the tedium of cooperating with a process that was at best a nuisance and at worst a serious operational disruption. He had known this was a possible cost when he made the call on the highway. He had made the call anyway. He did not regret it. He regretted 11 years of good behavior that had apparently failed to purchase the immunity he had assumed it purchased. But that was a separate matter and one he would address in the morning. He finished his tea. He set the cup down on the heavy wooden table in the warm kitchen of the shelter that Ruth Daly had built in the gaps of the system, and he sat there for another few minutes in the quiet of a man who has been moving towards something for several hours and has arrived and is now adjusting to the stillness of having done so. Then he got up and went back out to the porch. The Spokane charter was still in the gravel parking area, redistributed into smaller groups, some talking quietly, some simply waiting. The night had cleared while he was inside, and the cloud cover had moved east. And to the west, the sky had taken on the deep blue of the hour before dawn, the darkness thinning at its edges. Harwick came off the porch steps and stood beside him. "Word is moving," Harwick said. "Portland, Boise, Yakima. By morning, it's in 10 cities." "Good," Garrett said. They stood together and looked at the sky for a moment. "The charter inquiry," Garrett said. "Dodd will push it as far as he can manage before his own situation makes it untenable. That might be weeks, might be longer." "We've had inquiries before," Harwick said. "This one's different in origin," Garrett said. "I want Decker to contact the legal fund by end of week. I want documentation of tonight's timeline put together while it's fresh. Every man who was in the Black Anvil, everyone who rode the highway tonight. Times, locations, what was said, what was done." He looked at Harwick. "Clean documentation, the kind that holds up." Harwick nodded. Garrett looked at the house. The upstairs window where the light had come on was dark now. She was sleeping, or attempting to, in a clean room in a house that kept no records and answered to no county official within 300 miles of Harlan Greer. He thought about what Nora Pratt had said. She's my first call to the field office. The younger girl, 12 or 13, there one day and gone the next, transferred to another facility that nobody would name. He thought about the cot in the photographs and the padlock on the inside of the door and the child's shoe on the bare wooden floor. He thought about what a federal investigation looked like when it started with photographic evidence and a journalist with a field office contact and a trail of documentation already moving through independent networks in multiple cities. He thought it looked like the beginning of the end of something that should have ended before it began. He went back to his bike. He put his hand on the handlebar and stood there for a moment. He was tired in the way of a man who has been on a motorcycle for 6 hours in cold and rain, a tiredness that lives in the forearms and the lower back and the muscles around the shoulder blades that work constantly to hold a riding posture. It was a familiar tiredness. He had felt it before on long runs and it did not concern him. What he felt underneath the tiredness was something else, something harder to name and that he therefore did not try to name, simply registered as a quality of this particular night, of the cleared sky and the pre-dawn blue and the house behind him with its light going dark upstairs. He was about to throw his leg over the saddle when Ruth came out onto the porch. "She's asking for you," Ruth said. She said it without inflection, passing along a message, not attaching significance to it. He went back up the porch steps and through the house and up the stairs. Ruth had indicated the second door on the right. He knocked on the frame. The door was slightly open. "Come in," Chloe said. She was in the room Ruth had prepared, sitting on the edge of a bed with clean white sheets, wearing borrowed clothes, a flannel shirt and sweatpants, her hair still damp from the shower. The bruise on her face had been cleaned, and the split lip had been treated, and the swelling around her eye had not lessened, but had settled into the deep color of an injury that has been addressed as much as it can be for now. She was holding the prepaid phone loosely in her right hand. "Nora called back," she said, 40 minutes after I called her. She'd already spoken to her editor and to the FBI contact. Garrett stood in the doorway. "They're sending someone to Harney County tomorrow morning," Chloe said. "Not state, federal. They're treating it as a potential multi-jurisdictional case based on what she told them in the photographs." She paused. "She said the field office contact mentioned they'd had a flag on Harney County for 2 years, something from a different angle. What I sent her gave them a way in that they didn't have before." Garrett nodded. "She also said—" Chloe stopped. She looked at the phone in her hand and then set it on the nightstand beside the bed. "She said they would want to talk to me, at some point, as a witness." "We'll figure out how that works," Garrett said. "Ruth knows people who know how to structure those conversations in a way that keeps your location out of it initially." Chloe nodded. She looked at her hands in her lap for a moment, and then she looked up. "The girl from the group home," she said. "She has a name, Miley. I don't know her last name. I only knew her for 3 weeks before she was gone." She said the name plainly, without ceremony, the way you say the name of someone you want to make sure is not forgotten in the machinery of what is about to happen. "Miley," Garrett said. "Yes." He held the name for a moment in the way you hold something that has weight. "It's in Nora's notes," he said. "She heard you say it." Chloe looked at him. She held his gaze for a moment, and in it there was the same quality he had seen in the bar when she first crossed the room to him, the recognition of a specific kind of authority, but different now. Not the desperate, instinctive recognition of a person looking for a shield, something more considered. The recognition of a person who has had several hours to observe what a particular man does when the situation costs something, and has formed a conclusion based on evidence. "Why did you really do it?" she said. It was not the same question she had asked in the bar. That question had been shock-finding words. This one was something she had been carrying through the whole night, waiting for the right moment and the right configuration of quiet in which to ask it. Garrett stood in the doorway of the room for a moment. He thought about what to say. He thought about the version that was simple and self-contained, the version he had given her in the bar about not liking cops in his space, which was true as far as it went and went nowhere near far enough. He thought about the version that was accurate and somewhat more revealing. He thought about the version that was the whole truth, which he had not said to anyone in 12 years and was not sure he could say now with any particular fluency. "I made a wrong call a long time ago," he said finally. "Left somebody who needed me to stay." He looked at the floor briefly and then back at her. "Tonight I had a chance to make a different call. So I did." Chloe looked at him. She did not press him on it. She did not ask who or when or what had happened in the parking lot 12 years ago. She simply received what he had said with the serious attention of someone who understands that a man sharing a thing like that is doing something that is difficult for him, and that the correct response is not more questions but acknowledgement. She nodded once. He said goodnight and pulled the door to and went back down the stairs and out to the porch and stood in the pre-dawn dark and breathed the clean, cold air of the eastern Washington morning. He rode back to Harney County in the early light. The sun came up behind him as he crossed back over the state line, painting the mountains orange and amber, the wet road from the previous night's rain steaming faintly as the temperature climbed. He rode alone. Harwick had offered men for the return, but Garrett had declined. The situation behind him was resolved in the ways that mattered, and the situation ahead, whatever form it took when Dodd's inquiry materialized into actual process, was one he would handle the way he handled most things, with patience and the right lawyers and the long view that had gotten him through worse. The Black Anvil was dark and locked when he pulled into the lot. He sat on the bike for a moment and looked at the building in the morning light. The neon horseshoe in the window was off, the sign cold and dark, the lot empty except for his own machine and the early silence of a county road not yet awake. He unlocked the door and went inside. The bar smelled of the previous night, the stale beer and tobacco, and something underneath it that was the smell of a space that has recently held concentrated human stress. He went behind the bar and stood in the quiet and looked at the corner booth. The bar towel was still on the table where she had pressed it to her face. The cotton pad was there beside it. The ice had melted into a small pool of water that had run to the edge of the table and dried there, leaving a faint mineral line on the wood. He left it. He poured himself a glass of water from the bar tap and drank it standing up, and then he went and sat in the corner booth and looked at the door. What followed was the way things move through systems when the right evidence reaches the right people through a channel that cannot be managed by the people it implicates. It moved faster than he had expected. The FBI field office sent 2 agents to Harney County the morning after Chloe called Nora Pratt. They did not call ahead to the county sheriff's department. They drove in and went directly to the county home and pulled records and spent 4 hours in the facility before Dodd knew they were there. By the time he did, there were already conversations happening in federal channels that were above the altitude where Dodd had any meaningful relationships. Harlan Greer was arrested on a Wednesday, 6 days after the night at the Black Anvil. He was arrested in the parking lot of the Harney County Courthouse, which Nora Pratt later noted in her article was either a coincidence or a deliberate choice on the part of the arresting agents, and she believed it was the latter. Warren Dodd was arrested the following Monday. His arrest was quieter, conducted at his home in the early morning, and produced less of the visual documentation that makes arrests feel consequential, but it was consequential. The federal complaint ran to 31 pages and included, among other things, a reference to photographic evidence obtained by a minor whose identity was protected in the document by the designation Witness 1. Nora Pratt's article appeared in the Portland Tribune on a Thursday, 3 weeks after the arrests. It ran on the front page of the digital edition and was the most read piece the paper published that month. It named Greer and Dodd and described the operation in terms that were precise and thoroughly sourced. It mentioned the Kettner logging roads. It mentioned the cabin. It did not mention the Black Anvil Saloon or Garrett Mace or any member of any motorcycle organization. Because Nora Pratt was a specific kind of journalist who understood the difference between information that belonged in the public record and information that belonged to the people who had taken the risks that made the public record possible. The preliminary inquiry into the Harney County charter that Dodd had initiated closed without result 6 weeks after his arrest. The lawyer Garrett had retained had expected 8 weeks. He was pleasantly surprised. 4 months after the night at the Black Anvil, on a Tuesday evening in February, when the temperature had dropped and the barometric pressure with it in Garrett's right knee was reminding him again of its particular and permanent grievance, a letter arrived at the Black Anvil. Decker brought it to the corner booth without comment. It was a standard white envelope, the kind purchased in bulk at any drugstore, and there was no return address. The postmark was Spokane, which was information and was meant to be. Garrett's name was on the front in handwriting that was careful and slightly small, the handwriting of someone who had been told at some point that their letters ran together and had overcorrected. He opened it. Inside was a photograph. She was standing in front of a building, a school by the look of it, A brick facade and a set of wide concrete steps, and a flag on a pole in the upper right corner of the frame, the flag slightly blurred by wind. She was wearing a dark blue jacket over a light-colored shirt, and she was carrying a backpack over one shoulder. Her hair was shorter than it had been, cut to just below the jaw, and the bruise was gone, and the split lip was gone, and she was standing straight with her weight on both feet, both shoes on, and she was looking at whoever was holding the camera with an expression that contained within it several things simultaneously. The self-consciousness of someone being photographed who is not entirely comfortable with it, and underneath that, something else. Something more settled and less provisional than anything he had seen in her face on the night he had met her. He turned the photograph over, on the back, in the same careful small handwriting. "She's okay." See. He read it once. He read it again. He set the photograph on the table in front of him and looked at it for a while in the amber light of the bar. Then he reached down and opened the bottom drawer of the shelving unit behind the booth. The drawer that held the things that had no specific place in the operational structure of the bar or the club, but that he had held on to anyway. The things that occupied the category of objects too significant to discard and too private to display. He reached to the back of it and found what he was looking for and brought it out. It was a photograph as well, older, the finish slightly faded at the edges, a 4x6 print of the kind developed from film at a drugstore counter. A girl, 8 years old, standing in a yard with a sprinkler going in the background, her arms wide, looking at the camera with the complete and uncalculating happiness of a child who does not yet know that happiness is finite, or that the people responsible for it are fallible in ways that have consequences. He set it on the table beside the new photograph. He looked at both of them for a long time. The bar was quiet around him. Decker was behind the counter doing inventory. The jukebox was between songs. The neon horseshoe in the window buzzed its low, steady hum, amber and warm in the February dark. Garrett picked up both photographs and looked at them one more time, and something moved in his face that was not visible to anyone in the room, and that he would not have named if asked, because he did not have practice naming things like this, and was not sure the language he had developed over 52 years was adequate to it. He placed both photographs back in the drawer, the old one and the new one side by side, and closed it. He straightened up. He picked up his glass. "Decker," he said. "Yeah, another one." Decker poured it without looking up from his inventory sheet, and the glass arrived at the corner booth, and Garrett picked it up and drank it in the quiet of the bar, in the amber light, in the county that was slowly and messily working its way towards something that resembled justice. And he looked at the door the way he always looked at it, with the patient and watchful attention of a man who has been around long enough to know that the next thing to come through, it could be anything at all.